Small days is still on my mind. Small days is a good time. Remember some little children. I when they sing it and the dancers really admire them. Small days is still on my mind. Small days is a good time. Remember some little children. I when they sing it and the dancers really admire them. Yes, they're singing. Ring, ching, ching, ching. In a bag. See for mama. Get 10 fat chickens. And ask you for one. And she won't give me one. You see that girl named Dorothy. She fat like a butter. And she muggle like a chow. Oh, small days is still on my mind. Small days is a good time.
All right. Hey, guess what? It's another edition of Anansi Web Education right here on 107.1 FM. With me, as usual, is former president. Some still say president. It's okay. President David Arthur Granger is with us this week. And look at that smile on that face. What's going on? How did you spend your week, sir?
Well, it's pleasant. We're still in something of a drought. Of course, we had a very important, a very significant Islamic festival, al-Fitr. And I think that was the big event in terms of culture this week. I had the opportunity in living in Nigeria to see how that is observed. It is really the biggest Islamic celebration of the entire year, and we had that in Guyana. But otherwise, the drought continues. Unfortunately, Mark, I think everyone I've spoken to has complained about this smoke. There's so much smoke in the atmosphere that eventually I'm sure people come down with respiratory diseases because maybe the rice farmers, after they've cut the paddy, the stubble is burnt, and that has created a big problem. Even for drivers early in the morning, it's difficult to see maybe 100 or 200 meters ahead. But apart from that, life goes on.
Apart from that, life goes on. Also, our brothers and sisters in the Hindu community, they're celebrating a very special time as well. And so we want to extend that to them also. But quickly, you mentioned that you've spent some time in Nigeria and the celebration of these, especially Eid. What's the celebration like in Nigeria, the Eid celebration?
They are not as, I don't want to use a pejorative word, but they're not as maybe colorful and boisterous as the Hindu celebrations or the Christian celebrations. They're more staid, they're more conservative, and it is largely religious, and people go to the masjid. But most of the worshippers are male. I was living in northern Nigeria, so I cannot speak for the whole country. Most of the worshippers, most of them dressed in white, and of course, the fact that the population used to be about 98% Islamic meant that the masjids could not take off the crowd. So very often the crowd would be outside of the masjid and they'd be hearing the prayers through loudspeakers. And it would be difficult to pass on the road, because everybody be bowing and praying. But it was very joyful. They serve sweet meats and they greet families. It's village based, and they greet friends and relatives. And of course, the masjids are community. I suppose they're similar to Christian parishes, It's a day of jollification, of prayer, of kindness, and of course they give zakat. They help the poor and needy. It is not the day of sacrifice. Sacrifice is Eid al-Adha. This is one that comes at the breaking of the fast of Ramadan, and this is the time of the revelation of the Holy Quran to the Holy Prophet, on whom be peace. So I would say it is a deeply religious festival, and in fact, I was surprised that people in Guyana do not, observe Eid al-Fitr with the same degree of, dedication as they do in northern Nigeria. I think I've spoken to Muslims who feel that Eid al-Fitr is much more important than Eid al-Adha, because it comes at the end of Ramadan, and it's the time of breaking of the fast, and it's the time of the revelation of the Quran, and so on. It's really a powerful ceremony, a powerful event, a powerful celebration.
Powerful event, powerful celebration. As we get into our business here tonight, let me say good night to all of you who just joined us, whether you're in Guyana, outside of Guyana, wherever you are. Welcome to Anansi Web Education. As we get straight on into business, the U.S. State Department, as we take our folks back in time, the U.S. State Department of, let me just go that over again, the U.S. Department of State's International Narcotics Control Strategy Report. In 2021, Mr. Granger, they reported that narco traffickers are attracted by Guyana's poorly monitored ports, remote airstrips, intricate river networks, porous land borders, as well as by, and this is important, guys, by corruption and under-resourced security sector. This is what we'll be dealing with tonight. And as you know, for the 23 years that the PPP has been in office, narco state, Guyana was probably the top on the list for that region. Lots and lots of drug lords. But let's get straight to our first question, though. Why, Mr. Granger, why has the PPP administration failed to curtail narco trafficking?
If I can correct something you said, PPP has actually been in office for 27 years, since 1992. 23 plus 4, I mean, it's almost 4 years now. It means that they have overwhelming responsibility, overwhelming familiarity with the levers of power, the organs of state. So when you ask that question, you wonder why in 27 years they couldn't have gotten at the top of this issue. And I would say that there are several reasons. One is because you're dealing with industrial scale activity it makes a lot of people rich. There's a lot of money in narco trafficking. So some people are not interested in eradicating the trade. I say 27 years is a long time, and you ask why the administration, the PPP administration, appeared to curtail, because it makes people rich. That's the first thing I could say. The second thing is the incapacity. So one is the profitability, and the second is the incapacity, or they're not capable, because I think the Customs Anti-Narcotics Unit is ill-suited to bring narcotics trafficking to an end, or to even curtail it. And this could be achieved through administrative means. You just don't give them enough money to get the aircraft, or to get the boats, or to get the all-terrain vehicles that they need. So they cannot get to the airports or the airstrips where the trafficking is taking place. They cannot monitor the skies. They cannot monitor the rivers. So it is too weak. And we discovered in March that the United States had to tell us that there was an operation at sea mounted by a United States Navy guided missile cruiser, which intercepted one of these SPSs, self-propelled semi-submersible vessel offshore Guyana. This was in March. So this is not CANU's work. This is US DEA's work. So it means that we do not have the capability to monitor our own sea space. The other problem is corruption. And sometimes maybe some rogue members, I'm not saying all members, some rogue members of the enforcement agencies are aware of what is taking place, and they can be paid, bought off, or just told to disappear. They don't know what happened. And in the Customs Anti-Narcotics Unit on the previous administration, I think about 9 officers had to be dismissed, including the head of CANU. So this is a lucrative business, and I'm sure that members of CANU must be bombarded with requests for bribery and other forms of corruption. You must remember, during the Troubles, the deputy head of CANU was assassinated in Buxton, on the public road in Buxton.
That was Innes.
CANU is at the center of it. I'm not sure about the name, but I know that I know his position. So by keeping CANU weak, it makes Guyana as a whole incapable of curbing the narco trade. I would also say that the deliberate deployment of the police on this men of a mission, whatever it's called. The police should be at the borders. The police should be protecting our citizens. The police should be looking at our rivers. The police should be looking at our coast. The police should be looking at our airstrips. But never do you hear anything but the police anti-narcotics unit. So there's CANU and PANU. And sometimes they go up Borbis River and, they burn, a hectare or two of ganja, and it's big news. But in fact, the police are being deployed in areas in which they cannot, enforce the law against the narco traffickers. Everyone knows that Guyana doesn't produce cocaine, but the cocaine has to be coming in by air, land, or sea. And we have reports that, since 2020, there are at least 5 reported landings, all in the hinterland, but the police are never there. They only discover these landings when the plane has crash landed. And then, of course, the pilots cannot get rid of the cargo quickly enough, but it had to be a chartered flight. They're coming to deliver these commodities to someone. And, maybe there's an accident, and that's when it is discovered. I would say also that the intelligence system has been dismantled. Now, if a plane lands at a hinterland airstrip, you cannot know that in Georgetown. Somebody on the ground has to know that. Somebody in a village, some Tushao nearby, hear the plane flying at 2 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock at night. And there must be a system by which that village has a sort of information or intelligence committee, or that neighborhood has an intelligence committee. And that information is passed to the district. Then the district intelligence committee might tie it in with other information they received and pass it up to the region. And the region intelligence committee, which is made up of the regional chairman and the police divisional commander and the army commander, they then pass it to the central intelligence committee. So there are 4 levels. If it doesn't work, it means that somebody sitting in Georgetown, in Vlisingen cannot know what is taking place. So if you dismantle the system, if there's no village intelligence committee, and there's no district intelligence committee, there's no regional intelligence committee. The Central Intelligence Committee has nothing to report. So you cannot function without intelligence. And the planes don't land at Eugene Correa or Chelly Jagan. They land Maria and Bessaroni and Oriala and other places in the hinterland. So by misdeploying the police force or by deploying the police force incorrectly, whether it's deliberate or not, it means that the information cannot be moved from the location where the crime occurs up to the law enforcement agencies. And of course, in the regions, they don't have the capability to respond. So you've asked a very important question here. The whole system needs to be overhauled because the whole system has been paralyzed by administrative inaction. That is as much as I can say. They have failed to curtail narco trafficking, either deliberately by not ensuring that the law enforcement work, agencies work, or by not deploying the police to prevent these drugs from coming into the country. The drugs come from, it's part of a transnational network. Drugs are not manufactured locally. They're brought from overseas. They're brought from other places in South America. That is, that's not rocket science. We know that. But if you have blind policemen, if you have deaf and dumb, aviation or law enforcement officers, they wouldn't know what's going on. We need to open our eyes to transnational crime, particularly narco trafficking. And when that cocaine comes in, and bearing in mind what we've discovered, the sheer volume, tons of cocaine, being exported through these self-propelled, semi-submersible vessels. You can see how lucrative the trade is, how huge the trade is. And the government just has not put anything in place to stop it because some people are getting rich from it.
Rich from it, indeed. Rich, filthy rich from it, surely. Our second question, and let's welcome all of our listeners who have just joined us. Today we're dealing with this here. The State's Department, of course, the U.S. State Department in 2021, and not just in 2021, but in general. Mr. Granger did, and thanks for that correction, but I was talking specifically of the 23 plus years they've been in office. And then there was that lull in terms of massive drug shipment out of Guyana. Under the coalition, under your government, we saw by far less amount. In fact, the drug lords were even so scared that they probably were thinking of some other business, maybe whatever it is. But the cocaine under your administration wasn't slipping through as easy as it was under the Jack Deal's regime, the PPP's regime, for 23 years. And from 2020, August 2nd of 2020 to now, it has increased once again. Let's go to the second question. And the second question is, what measures are needed to prevent Guyana from becoming a narco state? Maybe again, a narco state again. But what measure or measures are needed, sir?
My answer would simply be that some of those measures are already in place, but there is no enforcement. Guyana has abided or they've signed agreements with neighboring countries, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, and Suriname. And Guyana adheres to United Nations agreements, conventions to prohibit narco trafficking. So the laws are in place, the agreements are in place, the conventions are in place. So we needn't go there. But what we need is enforcement. What we need is sincere implementation of those laws and those decisions. And that is where Guyana government is failing. Guyana, the present administration and PPP civic administration been in office for 27 years. We must get that clear. They were the ones who set up CANU 20 years ago. in 30 years ago, in 1994, by cabinet decision. This is the 30th year. It was actually implemented in 1995, but the decision was made then. So they are aware of the problem. They produced a national drug strategy master plan under then Minister of Home Affairs, who had to be brought before a commission of inquiry about certain matters. But it was never enforced. What we see now is that there's no political will. There's no political will to eradicate narco trafficking. And let me tell you this, many people speak about the Singapore miracle. If they catch you with a kilo or less of cocaine in Singapore and you're found guilty, you're heading for execution. And the same thing happens in China. Some of the orderly countries do not tolerate any trafficking in narcotics. And if we are to eradicate narco trafficking again, we have to get serious. I'm not saying we have to start executing people, but there is very low level of enforcement. Similarly, the Customs Anti-Narcotics Unit is a blunt knife. It is not an appropriate tool it is not a sharp enough tool for bringing narco trafficking under control. It doesn't have sufficient personnel, highly trained personnel. It doesn't have sufficient all-terrain vehicles. It doesn't have aircraft. It doesn't have sufficient boats. Narcotics is a national problem. It is not a Georgetown problem. It's not a West Coast problem. It's a national problem. And I don't think it will ever be a national force. It is a little unit. And what we need is a force almost on par with the police force. You need a major force that can travel around the country and bring this to an end. But I do not think the CANU is presently designed is capable of carrying that burden. It has birth defects. It was born stunted. It's a midget, and it has never really matured, quite frankly. And it's being deliberately kept weak. It is being deliberately kept weak. And there was an incident in the past in which, a lot of officers had to be removed because of corruption. And every now and then, they're given polygraph tests, and they fail the test. And the tests were administered by people from overseas. That's one of the reasons why in Jamaica, drug enforcement agency is much more efficient, because every so often people have to be subjected to, polygraph testing. And then the law, there is a national drug strategy master plan, but how many convictions are there? And on an annual basis, always get somebody a little pink suitcase, or someone who has been stupid enough to conduct this narco trafficking business in a public place, where they're quickly discovered. But the small couriers are the one who get discovered when you try to put a bit of cocaine in an envelope and post it to, relative in Toronto, or when you try to put cocaine in some part of your body in your underwear. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the people who are capable of moving cocaine by the container load, by submersible submarines. And we just don't have that capability. And if we are serious about eradicating or even curtailing cocaine trafficking, we have to reconceptualize, the counter-narcotics agency. That is why my administration created something called the National Anti-Narcotics Agency, an agency which could deal with the international community, which could deal with neighboring states, which could deal with the DA, not a little unit, And it's a question of capacity. And this CANU is a midget, created a midget and will always be a midget. And that's why we created the NANA, and I presume that's why the PPP dismantled the NANA when they got into power. It was too inquisitive. But some of the abuses which have occurred could never have occurred under the National Anti-Narcotics Agency.
All right, so this takes us, thank you so much for that. I appreciate that bit of information, but there was something else that went through my mind for a quick minute, that the current head of CANU was fired under your presidency. Then the PPP brought him back. And
No, he wasn't fired. His contract came to an end.
Okay, correction.
And it wasn't renewed. It was, and everyone knows that. He was never sacked. His contract came to an end, and we felt it was necessary to bring in new thinking. And another person was appointed, but he's never dismissed.
Got you. Thank you so much for that. His contract was not renewed, but the PPP brought him back. And with that, we're seeing all these cocaine, tons upon tons of cocaine. The one on this submarine.
Semi-submersible vessel, yeah. We have to get accustomed to these terms.
5,000 tons, pounds of cocaine. 5,000. This is shameless. And so there's a saying, though, that I saw some folks on social media saying, in order for PPP, in order for Guyana to grow, the PPP must go. And I'll say this now, in order for drugs to slow, the PPP must go.
Stop going.
Thank you. The final question, Mr. Granger, is how has the PPP administration's attitude to narco trafficking affected poor Guyanese?
It is my considered opinion that narco trafficking got during the last decade of the last century. And everyone knew it was becoming a very serious problem. The PPP was aware of that, and that's why CANU was created in the first place. That's why a National Drug Strategy Master Plan was promulgated. The PNC knew that, and that's why we created a National Drug Law Enforcement Committee, which was chaired by Mr. Hoyt. So they were quite aware of the danger of narco trafficking. And I am sure, from my research and my experience, that at the dawn of the present century, drug lords were behind the murders which were taking place, what we call the Troubles. And the head of the presidential secretariat at that time admitted publicly that what we're seeing here is not interracial warfare, it is drug gang warfare. So everyone should know that those murders which took place during the first 10 years were largely the result of drug gang warfare, drug lords fighting for territory. It meant that the government had to know and had to be tolerant, because they never implemented the very measures which they signed on to. So I would say that during the Troubles particularly, because that is the worst example of drug gang warfare, most of the people who died were poor people. These were people in villages, like East Coast villages or East Bank villages. These are not rich people. So the poor people suffer. And at any given time after 2000, the PPP administration had to be aware that the people being killed were poor and very often innocent people. Young, poor, usually unemployed persons were the ones who were suffering from the so-called drug war. Presumably, I don't know, some person might have been recruited as couriers to sell drugs in their communities, and these people were resented. Sometimes people who refused to cooperate with the drug lords were killed. And we know very well that one very senior police officer actually said that with the arrest of a major drug lord and his removal from the jurisdiction to the United States, there was a marked reduction in execution murders. What he might have been saying, and I think he wrote a book about it, what he might have been saying is that once the drug lord was present, the execution murders were rampant. And once that particular drug lord was removed, the execution murders declined. So what I would say is that you had an administration which was aware of the fact that the killings which were taking place were largely the result of narcotics trafficking. And they knowingly did not apply the very tools, the very instruments to bring narco trafficking to an end. And they allowed that to go on until, perhaps there was nobody left to kill. I recall that when I attempted to convene a commission of inquiry into the Lindo Creek massacre, because there were a dozen massacres. And those persons who were present at Lindo Creek just refused to talk. Now we're hearing that people want to convene a commission of inquiry into the killing, but let them do that. I promised to do it, but the very senior police officer said that all of the witnesses are being killed. So it is farcical to convene a commission of inquiry when the police themselves say there are no witnesses, because the witnesses have been killed. So I cannot come to any other conclusion but the fact that the PPP administration attitude, by appointing a cashiered army officer to be in charge of public security in the first place, and by convening a commission of inquiry to investigate his behavior, and by ignoring all of these international narcotics control strategy reports over a period of years, throwing national drug strategies through the window, meant that they were intent in not bringing narco trafficking to an end. I cannot mention one single thing that the PPP has done in its years in office to bring an end to narcotics trafficking, to arrest the big drug lords who were walking around, swaggering through the streets of Georgetown without being arrested. So I cannot come to any other conclusion. But the PPP was, I'm not suggesting they were complicit, but they were aware of what was taking place and they did nothing to bring it to an end. And when the APNU got into office in 2015, we set up a fit and proper agency, the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. And we had very regular meetings, which I presided over, to bring this scourge under control. But it had to be taken out of the hands of CANU and put in the hands of a national organization.
One of the things that as we look at, and again, thank you again for that, it appears that the PPP is not interested in fighting drug trafficking and going after the big drug lords. Even some of the smallest child in Guyana, you ask them to name a couple of drug lords, they would. But those who are heading the government right now seem to be turning a blind eye. And that's why we say in order for drugs to slow, the PPP has to go. One of the things you mentioned as we prepare to go, though, Mr. Granger, until next time, you did say that 30-something years ago, the PPP formed the CANU. But during that period as well, the same PPP, you could just assume that it was basically a superficial agency to just give this impression that they were serious about drugs. It is the same PPP that refused to have any cooperation with the DEA. Same PPP.
Well, if the DEA finally came, but it was a real circus for a long time, with the then head of the presidential secretariat giving reasons why a suitable place could not be found. But the Americans knew the game, and they set up offices in Trinidad and in Suriname. And eventually, the present president of Suriname, who was then the chief of police or the minister of justice,
Minister of Justice.
He was responsible for arresting a suspected Guyanese narco trafficker in Paramaribo and having him extradited to the United States. So the Surinamese were able to do more for bringing the executions and narco trafficking to curtail narco trafficking again than the Guyanese government itself. But Mr. Santoki was there.
Santoki, and that person was subsequently convicted and now back in Guyana, along with some of his soldiers, so to speak, not military soldiers, but were arrested and tied up in Suriname. Compliments of Santoki, Minister of Justice then. Mr. Granger, thank you so much as always. We'll be back next week, same place, same time. And again, I'm always, in this habit of leaving and talking about your kitchen garden, cost of living so high. And I urge people, if you have a nice little backyard, plant something, do something so that you can be like Mr. Granger, go and get your tomatoes, get your squash. I'm not sure if you like squash, but I love squash. I'm trying to find out what you have in that kitchen garden.
Okra, okras, tomatoes, cabbage.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joe. Yep, I and give my regards to Mistress Granger. Haven't seen her in a while, but hopefully she'll be back on Straight Up sometime soon. Hopefully. Thank you so much, Mr. Granger. Appreciate it.
Thank you and good night.
Yeah, good night indeed. And to all of our listeners, thanks. We'll see you back next week, same place, same time. Tata.
Really admire them. What they're singing? On your carpet, you must be like the roses, all you need, bright and shining. You must be, and show me the one, love the best. When I marry, I give you the ring. First the girls,